Okay, I'd now like to continue with the second focus question that we're going to look at today, and that is, what are the duties and liabilities of freight forwarders? Well, I guess the main thing to remember when we talk about the duties and liabilities of a freight forwarder is that there's no international convention in the field of freight forwarding. Thus, the duties and liabilities of a freight forwarding agent depend on national legislation, and obviously that's something that's going to vary from country to country. In common law countries, for example, a freight forwarder's rights and obligation are usually based on this concept of agency, where he acts or she acts on behalf of the consignor or the consignee in arranging the transport of the goods. As a general principle, an agency relationship will arise between two parties if they consent to the creation of a relationship between them. Now, there are 5 primary accepted duties of a freight forwarder, and the first one is that they exercise a duty of skill and care. And that is that in the delivery of the goods, they exercise a degree of skill and care which is consistent with the local customs of the country. And it's based around the standard of reasonable competency for a person performing that particular task. And that, if it came to litigation, would be a determination of the courts themselves. The second expected duty of a freight forwarder is that they act with reasonable dispatch. So they've got an obligation to meet time requirements consistent with what the industry norms are for the delivery of those goods. And also, in that context, they are required to keep the shipper informed if perhaps they are unable to meet that primary obligation of the goods arriving as per that industry norm and the customer's expectation. And that's mainly because that presents an opportunity for the shipper to make perhaps some alternative changes. Now, I guess in this particular area of relationship between the agent and as the freight forwarder and the shipper, the freight forwarder should most likely avoid themselves from providing guaranteeing an arrival time to his customer. And the main reason for that is because as the agent, that's really out of the hands of the freight forwarder. That's really in the hands of the carrier themselves. And most likely they are not going to provide that level of information to the agent. The third area of duty expected of a freight forwarder in facilitating the movement of goods is the duty to follow the principal's instructions. So the shipper will provide some instructions to the freight forwarder as an agent, and the expectation is that the freight forwarder is going to follow those instructions. Now, the only time that might vary is if the instructions themselves indicate some unlawful behaviour on behalf of the freight forwarder. Because ultimately the freight forwarder, as the agent in that particular relationship, has also the requirement to inform the principal of any loss of cargo. Because that is important for the shipper who may ultimately want to undertake some legal proceedings against the carrier. So they have got a duty to inform if cargo loss occurs, and to that end, they are required as the agent to inform the carrier, if this happens, that there may be a situation where a claim may be put in. The first option, or the fourth duty, if you like, is to show care in selection of the carrier. But mindful that they've got to, if they have any prior knowledge of that carrier, they should inform the shipper. So if perhaps there's been some litigation against that carrier's been shown perhaps to not perform in their role in the best possible manner, that's something that should be shared. However, once the cargo is moved from the shipper to the carrier, the agent or freight forwarder is not liable for what the carrier does. So as long as they perform the normal obligations competently, then they are not liable for the carrier's actions. And finally, there is an expectation of a duty to advise insurance. Now, I guess the important thing about this in many ways is the agent is not obligated to do this. However, I guess an industry norm is that it is considered to be good practice. And that's mainly because typically the carrier will have limited liability over the replacement if any goods go missing or are damaged. So if the shipper seeks to get some redress for the loss, it's important for them to consider insurance. Also, it might cover the situation where most shippers, in their own considerations, believe it's the agent who's liable for any loss of goods, which is not actually the case. So that's the duties. In terms of the liabilities, as a forwarding agent, there are a number of expected liabilities. And the first one is dealing with duty, breach of duty. So any of those aforementioned duties, the agent might be liable or could be liable or is liable to its customer, the client, the shipper, for loss of damage. So if they made false statements, for example, about the carrying vessel, if they weren't clear on the manner of loading, perhaps they didn't provide the actual shipping date, or they provided the actual shipping date, that may come back and make the agent liable. Also, for example, the agent may say to the shipper that they're going to procure some insurance on their behalf, because that's something that agents do from time to time, because usually they can get some form of commission from doing it. If they don't do it, and damage or loss occurs, they may be called upon to cover that loss. The second area of liability for the freight forwarder is related to that loss of goods. So if the agent is persons in their employ cause loss or damage to the goods through a level of negligence or undue care, that will be make the agent liable for the loss of those goods. And finally, and this relates to negligent advice and misrepresentation. The agent is liable for poor advice if the loss is reasonably foreseeable consequence of the negligent advice and misrepresentation. So ultimately, this really, as much as anything else, relates to clarity to the shipper on what is going to go on in the movement of the goods to the consignee and the role of the carriers in that performance. It really highlights one of those key areas of oversight by the freight forwarder, and that relates to documentation and getting that documentation correct and having the correct communication. Finally, in regards to duties and liabilities, it's important to consider that the freight forwarder may actually step into the shoes of a carrier. And when they do, as a principal, and they become more liable for certain aspects of the movement of those goods. So the principal typically will do so if they're providing some additional ancillary services to facilitate the movement of goods in his own right. And that's usually by virtue of using his own assets or becoming, as I said before, the carrier for the performance of the task. Now, in this situation, the principal is responsible to the shipper for his own accident emissions, which we know is the case as his role as an agent. But in addition to that, as a principal, he's responsible for the accident emissions of his employees or any independent contractor or agent. So the accident emissions of the carrier in this particular case. And I guess the most common example of this is when the freight forwarder acts as an MVOCC. In other words, they take on the role of the carrier. They issue the transport document, but they don't actually own the vessel. And that's quite common in a situation of multimodal transport contracts, where they involve a series of different modes of carriage and a number of different carriers. And this is more commonly used in the movement of containers. And in this particular situation, as a principal, they're often referred to as a multimodal transport operator. And that's, as I said before, a service provider that offers a point-to-point transportation under a single shipping document, a door-to-door service, if you like, which includes the shipping movement by shipping as one part of an integrated range of transport options. Okay, so we're going to finish off with a summary of the role of the freight forwarder and how that's evolved over the years. And a good way of looking at this is by having a look at a continuum as the from a one-party logistics to a fifth-party logistics. So a first-party logistics is a situation where it involves just two parties moving goods from seller to buyer. Historically, most producing companies had their own warehouses, they had their own fleet of trucks. So most of those manufacturers was doing all the logistics characteristics themselves. So that's commonly referred to as first-party logistics. So moving those goods from the seller to the buyer. Now, in some cases, they may have utilised a warehouse to store some goods, or they might have used the auspices of a particular port to perform some tasks on their behalf. Those entities would often be called a first-party logistics operator. Over time, as through the 70s and 80s, evolved the second-party logistics operator. Now, this was typically a situation where logistics requirements were outsourced to another party, and that other party had their own assets. They might have had their own transportation, they might have had their own storage, and they might have handled the cargo themselves. Now, this was really manifested itself in the 1980s, and this is where the manufacturer saw the benefits of just focusing on their core competencies and outsourcing logistics requirements, something that another person could do on their behalf at a more economical rate. Now, second-party logistics providers usually were more geographically wider than one-party logistics. So you could see if one-party logistics is perhaps a local distribution, a second party, we're starting to grow further geographically. So we're talking about international shipments in many cases in this particular scenario. And as I said before, often they own the trucks, or they own the aircraft, they own the wherewithal to get those goods to the final party. So to that end, you can actually refer to second-party logistics organisers as airlines, shipping lines, and of course freight forwarders. Third-party logistics is most likely where you find the majority of movement of cargo in this present time. It really started to take hold mainly in the 1990s. And this is where logistics organisers or service providers integrated themselves into customers' supply chains. So the relationship between a 2PL and its customer and a 3PL where its customer, the 3PL is a lot closer to its customer. They also typically, they would have a longer term partnership. And it's quite possible that they might organise the entire logistics activities of that particular customer. So in addition to the types of expectations of a 2PL, transportation, storage and handling, they're also adding in additional services, ancillary services. It could be specific packaging, it could be assembly of parts, it could also be a level of IT integration as well. Certainly track and trace would be an absolute basic requirement. One of the main reasons driving importers and exporters to use these third-party logistics is because these third-party logistics organisers were quite had a significant size to them that could offer economies of scale to these companies, which ultimately resulted in some significant lowering of logistics costs than the manufacturer could achieve themselves. Beyond third-party logistics, we've got fourth-party logistics. Now, fourth-party logistics is a competence in the coordination of more complex processes covering the entire supply chain. And it usually involves the utilisation of sophisticated IT systems. In addition to that, where third-party logistics is more about a company coordinating their own operations on behalf of their client, more often than not, in third-party logistics, it's more an allocative function. In other words, they don't necessarily have their own assets, but rather they act as a single mode-neutral partner for that particular organisation, selecting the best 3PLs, the best freight forwarders and other logistics companies to fulfil the task of that particular client. Now, that's not to say that a 4PL may have their own assets, but if that's the case, there'd have to be a strong level of trust between the client and that particular four-party logistics organiser, so that they're not integrating, they're not favouring their own logistics services on behalf of best practice or the best available opportunity. When we get to the fifth party logistics, we're actually talking about supply chain management solutions and logistics consultancy services to a point of utilising new technologies and effectively building a mechanism within that company to increase the visibility right across the value chain itself. And these days you will find that there's some significant performers in this particular market. So Deutsche Post, DHL Group is one of the largest, as are Kuhn and Nagel. Third-party logistics is primarily where most of the freight forwarding services are centering at this point in time. So I've got a definition there of third-party logistics, and we see it as a provider of logistics services that performs all or part of a client's company's logistic functions. So all of those functions that I was talking about may be performed all or part. So if we wanted to shortlist a service portfolio of a typical third-party logistics provider, what we'd say is that they provide managing and operating services for the following functions: transport, warehousing, materials management, information-related services, and other related services to the movement of the goods to the end customer. So, in a way of explaining, this slide shows the evolution of the third-party logistics in light of the traditional activities of the customs broker and the traditional activities of the freight forwarder. So the third-party logistics operator is taking all those responsibilities of the customs broker, so overseeing the exportation and importation of goods and the relevant documentation around that, the maintenance of records, the payment of applicable fees, the services of a freight forwarder, so that a negotiation and arriving at the best method of transport, coordinating the transport, doing the appropriate documentation. So those same duties plus warehousing and storage, inventory management and distribution, information-related services, so the integration of track and trace as well as electronic data interchange, as well as some of those ancillary services such as a secondary assembly and also perhaps product inspection. So a lot of what we'll be talking about over the next 11 weeks are going to centre around the freight forwarder in the context of a third-party logistics provider. And that's all I wanted to say today, and thank you for listening, and we will see you again next week.